I want to wrap this session up with a few thoughts. Crisis is about leadership. Crisis is about, surely is about strategy and scenario planning. But crisis is a time, and if it does not engage our faith, we have a fundamental problem as leaders. If we do not come, I was reading Daniel day before yesterday or yesterday, where the angel appears to Daniel as he goes through all this vision and dreams. The angel comes to Daniel and says, "You are greatly loved by God. I desire this and hope this, and this has been my prayer, like I said, post-COVID, you would, and through this agonizing moment, I hope that all our organization and each of us would hear this saying from God himself saying, you are greatly loved." And I would like to offer that as my prayer and desire for each of us. Nehemiah is a classic example of how he handled this time of crisis. And let me take you through quickly a few thoughts. I based my reflection on chapter 4 and 6 of Nehemiah. Clearly, here is someone who is wanting to rebuild this wall, and it wasn't simply bricks and cement. It was really a question of rebuilding the identity of the people of Israel, and which was shattered, highly demotivated people, reflected in the poor quality of the wall. And so Nehemiah was here trying to rebuild the wall. And very interesting, one of the reasons as to why Sanballat, Tobiah, Arabs, Ammonites, and others were against Nehemiah was not because they had some personal animosity with Nehemiah. In Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 10, it says, they were upset that Nehemiah was doing something for the welfare of the people. Very often, this is the sin of Christian organizations, as our outsiders and detractors would often want to see us. Our sin in the eyes of the world is we take our stand with the poor, with those who are hurting, those who are vulnerable. And they will do everything, including the devil himself, evil one himself, will do everything to exploit a crisis like the pandemic to stop the work of Christian organizations. You do not want to succumb to that. So this opposition from Sanballat, Tobiah, Arabs, Ammonites, one of the things you'll see as you read these chapters, you'll see evil attracts friends very easily. Quite a few people gathered together to attack Nehemiah's project. There was a Sanballat and Tobiah, and they are people from different groups. And you and I know this as Christian organizations. We tend to, by our particular bias in favor of those who are vulnerable, will naturally attract enemies. And they would need not be from the same stock, same ideology. They could be from all kinds of people. And they say, like history says, as a result of every crisis, there is a birthing of authoritarianism. And you and I, in some sense, need to be ready as an organization to deal with it. If you look at chapter 4, you will see verse 1, Sanballat wanted to mocks the people of Israel. He calls them, you feeble Jews. Can be thrown at any Christian organizations. We are hardly a handful of organizations in a huge nation like India, 1.3 billion. And then if you read all our vision and mission statements, it's like we want to transform a nation. We want to change our nation. We want to renew our nation. How is it possible? They would probably say, no, you are such weak-kneed people, Christians. How do you make such huge claims about transforming a nation? But that's the metal, that's our DNA. We are ordinary people who make big claims because we have a God who is sovereign. And then he calls it the weak walls. The walls you build are weak, so weak, if the fox runs over it, Sanballat says, I think Tobiah says it, the wall will collapse. That's how weak your work is. A few organizations here, a few hundred children in your school, a few people that you serve in few communities, not going to transform our nation. You're such a weak work. And so you'll have these detractors who will come at us at a time of crisis like this. Nehemiah also, the people, the enemies of Nehemiah, conspired to cause confusion. And very interesting, the confusion is internal to the people of Israel. Judah, for example, came and told Nehemiah, it's just too difficult to work. We can't do this. You'll have this happening internal to your organization. There might be people who not negative to you, but depressed. Is it really possible? Can we respond to a crisis like this when we ourselves are living in fear, locked down? And the Jews who lived near them, they were discouraged. It actually says in verse 12, if you go back to Nehemiah and read it, 10 times they came and told Nehemiah, it's just simply not possible. This is a possibility when there is a crisis and when there are detractors that will suddenly start congregating around us as Christian organizations. Internal, our own staff motivation begins to sag. This is where your leadership really matters, to be able to motivate our staff. The other thing they will do is seek to kill and stop the work. The mocking and the calling names of the people of Israel was not enough. In verse 11, it says, they did everything to kill and stop the work and continued to conspire. If you go to chapter 6, verse 2, they spread lies. They told about Nehemiah, your actual purpose for building the wall was you wanted to rebel against the king. In our nation, we know the power of lies. You retweet lies 100 times, it becomes truth in our nation, unfortunately. And that's the kind of context in which you and I are seeking to deal with crisis. Manipulation. Very interesting, they use religion. Actually, they call Nehemiah to come for negotiations. And Nehemiah says, my work is too important for me to come and negotiate with you. And then very interestingly, they use religious leaders to invite Nehemiah to come to the temple for negotiations. And Nehemiah sensed that this is not of God. Intuition. This is where you sense what God is, that tug in your heart. As leaders, be sensitive to the tug in our hearts. This is when you and I need to be intimate with our God at a time of crisis as leaders. There are 4 lessons that I want to offer you from Nehemiah as a response, 4 principles. Very naturally, Nehemiah brought God into this situation, into this conversation. It was not simply the analysis of the pandemic itself, but the analysis of where are the fingerprints of God in this analysis. I was very interesting on the March 22nd curfew and the banging of plates in our nation. And then consequently, all of us going to the balcony, asked to go to the balcony and light diyas. The number of Hindu interpretations that were floating around in our WhatsApps. Our Hindu friends were using this opportunity to inculcate a Hindu perspective on reality. The nation is really hungry for perspective. And this is where you and I want to be able to say, we sense with the sense of tentativeness to say, we sense this just might be what God is doing in our nation. Not fire and brimstone and judgment like some of our Christian friends seem to say, that this God is going to judge and this God's judgment against us for A, B, C, D sins, recognizing that the first candidates to be called sinners are you and me, that we are just simply offering the voice of God. So this is a time when you really want to see the fingerprints of God as leaders, being intimate with God at this time, so that your staff would see that during times of crisis, my leader is close to God. He is intimate with God. He seeks the face of God. He reads the word to understand God's mind. You'll see the phrases that you'll see in this. He remembered the Lord, verse 14. In verse 5, it says, it is talking about Sanballat and Tobiah, what they are doing. Nehemiah is telling God, it is you they are provoking, not us. Just imagine if we are the apple of God's eye, and we should be able to rightly and honestly say, God, it is you they are hurting, not us. And then in verse 20, he reminds the nobles and others, our God will fight for us. And he says, pray to our God, dependent on God. Verse 6, when they're asking him to come and negotiate, I like this phrase which says, Nehemiah looked up. And I would like to almost put words into Nehemiah's mouth. Maybe like Psalm 121, it says, Oh Lord, where do we look to for our help? Not just to the mountains, but the God who created the mountains. Intentionally bring God into the situation, a leadership habit of intimacy with God. The second thing that Nehemiah seemed to have done, and the people also you would see, is they had a mind to work. This is when our organizational bar on competence and performance should go much, much higher. I've seen this, and it is not rocket science, easily doable. If we were to do, the language that I used was, for every rupee invested in World Vision is money borrowed from the poor front end. We should be able to multiply it 7 times and reinvest it in them. Similarly, you and I are stewards of the money that actually belongs to the poor. And we should be able to multiply it and give it back to the poor, not 7 times, now 10 times, or whatever times. This is when the performance bar of the whole organization should go up. Don't waste this crisis opportunity. Don't settle down to say, oh, this is when our organization has completely is low on motivation, low on budget, low everything. So what can we do? We sit and sulk. Not allowed. Leaders don't sulk. Leaders lead from the front. You want to be able to pursue work with it. I like this phrase, for the people had a mind to work. As though whatever Sanballat and Tobiah had said was immaterial, incidental, they completely ignored it. They had a mind to work. This is when all our staff, whether we are in the office, working from home, we should be able to say, oh, this is when we want to work hard. 24/7, and not in terms of time, but in terms of commitment. You want to be 24/7 teams. This is when you redefine work and excellence as being benchmarking rather than simply compliance. The third principle of Nehemiah's response, I like the way he organized his team differently. Some were working, some were holding spears. Some did work with one hand and held spears in others. And he led by examples. He says in the last verses of chapter 4, he says, my servants and me, we did not even sleep. We did not even change clothes. We worked hard. Leaders lead from the front. It's an opportunity to try out various combinations in terms of what can we do as a team. Maybe our whole organogram becomes useless. This is the time to revisit organograms and say, maybe it's a different kind of an organogram. We want to come post-COVID. We want to be a different kind of an organization, a new normal in some sense. The last principle in Nehemiah's response, that was a great opportunity for him to remind them of the bigger picture. We fight for each other. We are not just building the wall. This is about God. God will fight for us. This is about God being provoked. This is a time for you to remind the organization of the actual vision and mission, because for too long, we thought strategy was our vision and mission. Strategy, remember, at best, is only a means to achieve a vision and a mission. Too long, we've been locked in our own budgets and board meetings and those kinds of things. God just might be shaking us from our autopilot mode and saying, this is the time to look at the bigger picture and remind ourselves of the bigger picture. Remember, God wants to transform a nation of 1.3 billion people using your organization. Don't waste this opportunity. Remind your staff using this as an opportunity. So 4 principles as we deal with COVID-19, lockdown, panic, fear, impact on ministry, whatever it is. Impact on ministry by the evil one himself, impact on ministry by a emerging authoritarian leadership in our country, quite a few detractors in our nation about our work. You will have people throwing allegations against us, lies against us, saying we are using this pandemic to convert people. In all those moments, 4 lessons: recognize and acknowledge God. As leaders, you lead in identifying the fingerprints of God in your organization and in your nation at a time like this. Job description of a leader. Second, renew passion for work and excellence. This is the time to revive that passion. When you remember when you interviewed that staff first time and asked them, why do you want to join your organization? They gave you a long speech. This is the time to remind them of that speech. and say, this is why you wanted to be part of this organization. Third, reboot your team, lead from the front. You just might need a different organogram at this time. Emerging young leaders, pay attention to them. Those who are lagging behind for good reasons, pay attention to them. Look at your staff as individuals who need compassion. Communicate with them and lead from the front. Fourth, remind yourselves and ourselves of the bigger picture. This is about mission continuity and not just sustaining my organization and somehow managing crisis, but you're leading through crisis. The result of this, very interesting. We go back to 4 and 6 chapters. The enemies were angry. The number of times Nehemiah irritated his enemies by simply silence. They're simply being silent. Carried on with business, his own work, which was important for him. Second, God frustrated their plans. A pandemic, a crisis like this, unfortunately becomes an instrument in the hands of the evil one to destroy God's work in our nation. In chapter 6, verse 16, the enemies come to this conclusion, for they perceived that their work had been accomplished with the help of our God. I sincerely trust this would be India's conclusion, seeing the way you and I handle and ride in this crisis wave to be able to renew and transform our nation. Thank you very much, Anand.